Greetings. I hope you're all doing well, having a good week. For this week 3 presentation, I'm going to be looking at this time period of early adulthood and some of the key developmental variables associated with this from both like a physical cognitive aspect, but also like emotional and interpersonal, right? So like, what are some of the layers of complexity we're dealing with as adults and I can just see like the next slide coming up, right? This whole idea around intimacy and isolation. Like, what does it mean that this next developmental challenge is at the level of our ability to develop, maintain, and nurture long-term healthy relationships, right? And how is this related to mental health as adults and community and family and all these interrelated topics? All right, let's get into it. Hope you're doing well. You're an awesome group. Grab a coffee and or whatever. I don't know. That's like my saying, grab a coffee or something. But yeah, appreciate you. Hope you're doing well. And let's get into it. So I have a little note here. It says like, recall that Erickson and this whole like Erickson's whole idea, right? And again, I don't say it on the slide there, but this is his psychosocial model, right? Like, you've heard this term now, basically every presentation, and the significance of psychosocial, or of those two words being together, and this idea of our psychological development being tied to the challenges put on us by our society associated with the stage that we're at, and the idea that like at every stage we're being pressured in different ways. And that's true for the baby establishing trust early. That's true for the child establishing autonomy and initiative and industry at school. That's true for, the teenager trying to establish, and early adult trying to establish identity. And it's true for the, emerging or young adult trying to establish what he called intimacy. And intimacy means much more than just romantic intimacy, although it can also include that. So this note says, recall that Erickson postulated or says that identity, he's saying like identity versus role confusion, right? Like, in every situation you go into, you're out with this group of people, you act this way. You're out with this people, you act this way. It's like you're at work, you act this way. You're out on a date, you act this way. You're like acting, and you're so different. It's like if somebody was watching you, they'd be like confused as to what character you're playing in the movie. It's like you're confused, and it's like you're a different person everywhere. It's like that's the opposite of having like a solid identity, in the sense that like, well, what's your identity? It's what stays consistent. It's like at a certain level, it's like your pattern of behavior and responding to things. And it's like that's somewhat of your personality too. But my point is that like, and we all change a bit. Like, I obviously act differently if I'm out at a pub with friends versus if I'm at a funeral versus if I'm theoretically at a job interview or something, right? But the more stable my identity is, the more I'm consistent across those different things. And he said that like, the less stable your sense of who you are, the more you just sort of change with the wind. And he called that role confusion. Yeah, it took forever to say that. So the identity versus role confusion thing, pursuing who we are, what we're all about, where we're going in life, and that whole identity thing is the most important issue to be negotiated in adolescence. But in early adulthood, Erickson turns his attention to this idea that after individuals are well on their way to establishing a stable and successful identity, they enter the 6th stage, which is intimacy versus isolation. Erickson describes intimacy as finding oneself without losing oneself in another, and it requires commitment to another person, right? And this is sort of like the definition on the screen, that intimacy is the capacity to engage in a supportive, affectionate relationship without losing one's own sense of self. So that's an important two-part thing, right? It's like, it's the ability to basically develop a strong relationship while being true to yourself, while maintaining your identity, the capacity to engage in a supportive, affectionate relationship without losing yourself in it. Right? Development in early adulthood often involves balancing intimacy and commitment on the one hand, and a need for independence and freedom on the other hand. At the same time as individuals are trying to establish an identity, they're facing the challenge of increasing their independence from their parents, developing intimate relationships with others, and continuing friendships and other commitments. They also face tasks of making decisions for themselves without always relying on what others say or do. I read that weird because my computer made a weird sound there, and I got paranoid that it wasn't recording. They also face the task of making decisions for themselves without relying on what others say or do. So basically, it's also the stage where the pressure on you to making just think of yourself, right? The pressure on you to make decisions, like what are you going to do with your life, where are you going to live, who are you going to date, what's your career going to be, are you interested in having kids? It's like you're at this stage where there's so many relationally heavy questions. So like that's kind of what intimacy is. Intimacy is a depth of relationship with a element of commitment. Well, we'll get into this. We'll keep going on this. This is the first slide. All right, next slide. Alrighty. One of the See, this is an interesting one because this is like one of the easiest to explain in a way, but one of the deepest. So it's like one of the easiest to, add to your note and then move on to the next thing. But what he's saying is actually super deep here, that just like other developmental goals, right? Just like a kid not learning at school that they can do things and complete tasks can be related to the development of feelings of inferiority, or that like how a teen not developing a sense of identity can make them feel like they have role confusion and they're constantly changing who they are, or like the baby that doesn't establish trust, establishing a cynical sense of mistrust. Erickson said there's always this like flip, right? That there's the challenge to establish intimacy, and then the related cost of if that's not achieved, if that's not done. Like what Erickson would consider a developmental crisis now is that now this idea of like, what if you don't have that, right? If we're saying that like a major part of development in early adulthood is the ability to develop kind of meaningful and sustainable long-term relationships, and then if people don't have that, what's the cost? And Erickson would say, well, the cost is isolation. And what's isolation? It's being lacking depth in your relationships, right? That he's like on the screen here, it says results from relationships that are inadequate, that lack self-disclosure, and they're filled with unresolved identity crises. Now here's the interesting thing, right? Isolation can be both by yourself and with others. Erickson would say like you could definitely be dating someone and still be feeling isolated. You could definitely be in a sexual relationship and still feel a complete lack of psychological intimacy. So he's saying, notice how it doesn't say that isolation is being by yourself, right? It's kind of like, and I don't know how else to say it, but it's like being by yourself at like a soul level, like at a deep level, not like a lack of self-disclosure. Think of what that means, like a lack of me self-disclosing to you is like me being myself to you. Sometimes that might be me telling you a story about a thing that happened to me. Sometimes it might be me disclosing to you my honest opinion on something. Right? That have unresolved identity crisis that I'm like so wrapped up in figuring out who I am, and the people I'm with, they're so wrapped up in figuring who they are that we're not with each other. And that this is the risk of a lack of depth. The risk of a lack of depth is psychological isolation. And then like add the pandemic and all that stuff to it and everything. So it's like, I think this would be an interesting question to hear some of your responses to, right? Like if, especially if you, like, I don't know, with your age, if like, did you do a couple of years of high school in COVID? Or I guess it would have been maybe your last year of high school, your first year of university. And the reason I'm saying that is because like if Erickson's saying that one of the main developmental tasks in this early adult period is basically establishing interpersonal relationships, like what does being in large scale society wide lockdown play as a factor, right? Which is maybe a little bit less relevant now, but not that long ago. Right? How did isolation affect people at such a right, like the human, again, this is like twice in the same slide to use the word soul, but the soul needs other people. It's like in prison, solitary confinement is used as a form of torture. It's like it's torturous for you to lack intimacy. All right. So there's an interesting idea here by this researcher named Jeffrey Arnett, and he has if you look around a little bit on the course site, you'll see that I have multiple articles from this guy at different points in the course, which is just because he's a pretty and not pretty, he's like one, I would say one of the most established developmental psychologists on this idea of like the adult part of adulthood or of development. And he has this concept of emerging adulthood, right? That think of what emerging means. It means like, well, emerging means like you're becoming something, and that becoming is coming from inside you. It's like you're emerging as an adult, right? And that now as you're emerging as an adult, you're dealing with adult style options, right? And what that means is that now it's like, well, you're not a kid anymore. Now it's like, what are you going to do with your life? How are you going to pay for things? Where are you going to live? Are you going to date people? What are you going to do? Are you going to have kids? Are you going to go to school? Are you going to get a job? It's like all these very kind of serious and commitment and obligation filled questions. It's like, but then he's saying, but this is like why it's also unique. So it's like not like being a teen when you're a bit younger, because now you have all these kind of the weight of being an adult, but at the same time you have still like I say there like there's parts of the brain that are related to impulse control, like the aspects of the myelination of your prefrontal cortex is still not completely done. So like you're still in that sense like close to being a teenager. So it's almost like he's saying this is this unique in-between period where impulse control is not as high as it's gonna be in a couple years. And it's not like comparing, if you're like 21 or 22 and you're looking at this slide, it's like it's not comparing you to older people and saying you have less impulse control. It's like it only makes sense if you compare yourself to yourself. If you're 21 right now, statistically, it would be safe to guess that you'll have more impulse control in 3 years than you do now, right? And that's like not talking about any one of you, obviously, specifically, but talking like very generally. Just based on how like that's totally just based on the age at which the average person's prefrontal cortex is completely finished, the myelination process. For most individuals, I have a piece I want to read here. Moving from adulthood into adolescence involves a lengthy transition period. This transition period has been referred to as emerging adulthood, which by psychologist and researcher Jeffrey Arnett. This is a period of increasing independence and autonomy. Experimentation and exploration characterize this period of development. For example, during these years, many individuals are exploring what career path to follow, what they want their identity to be, what they want their lifestyle to be. So it's this not really a teenager yet, not really fully an adult yet, almost in this in between or this emerging stage. If you look at this, psychologists and their models, it's like psychologists love to try to like put their idea in a picture, and it's useful, right? It's like if you just kind of study this picture, you'll get a good understanding of his whole idea of emerging adulthood and how it relates to resilience. He's saying that there's like the capacity to change and transform your life at this like in this period of early adulthood, in this like late teens, early 20s, is very different than any other time in your life. And there's a lot of unique things going on at the time, and some of it is some of the opportunities that are available to you. Like even just take yourself for example. Maybe you're living at Nipissing, maybe you've moved from somewhere else, and it's like you're away at school. Maybe there's through your school, there's maybe even potential work opportunities in the future that are like available, and maybe there's even like opportunities like maybe you find your true love, right? It's like those are all what you would call transformational contexts, right? Those are situations that would change your life. And then there's like, on the left side there, it's like you might have mentors that play a role, or hopefully that you have a couple adults in your world that are saying things in your best interest, and it's like, and then hopefully you have like decent timing and a little bit of luck. And he's putting those on kind of the outside as like these like other factors. And then there's an aspect of it, it's like how well you do is going to be highly related to your what he calls strategic executive control, like your focus, how much you can stay focused on what you're trying to do. And he calls that future orientation, and how much you can motivate and kind of aim your own intention and stay committed and persistent. And he called that like self-direction. And then like how much you can actually make it a detailed targeted plan and move towards that planfulness. Planfulness is a weird word, but and then the motivation part, right? Like how to stay hopeful, how to increase self-efficacy or your belief in your ability to do it, how to the aspiration or to fill with spirit. And so this is his idea, is that like it's what is unique about this period is this interesting interplay between opportunity, motivation, and how the way you engage that plays a huge, right? It's not like this is just happening to you. You're also behaving and making decisions. And I was hearing like it's like you do like 500 things a day basically, right? And it's like your whole day is a whole bunch of little behaviors and decisions. That's a weird thing to tie in 3 minutes into the slide. But basically, the idea is like there's unique opportunities, and then how you kind of stay focused and work towards things and are planned and self-directed and all that stuff is kind of that's what that word in between motivation and strategic executive control that just says agency. It's like what's that word just doing sitting there? Well, that's what that means. There's you in there. Agency means I have agency over, I have some control over what happens in my, like I can control how focused I am. I can control how hard I'm working. I can control how hard I'm working to stay motivated. So agency basically just means how the individual person engages this whole system matters. Okay, and then the last slide. Oh, not the last slide of the presentation, but the last slide of my night. Because this is Thursday, it's like 12:15 at night, and I'm getting a little tired. So, and I don't want to be tired and then turn it into like a boring presentation or whatever. So, anyways. Again, like that, I should cut that out. That's like just a nothing rant for 30 seconds, but okay. The key features of emerging adulthood. So I would ask you to have this in your note, right? That like what Arnett's saying is key features, you know what that means, but it's like sometimes interesting to break it down. That's like really saying, okay, well, like what is unique about this period? If you were going to say it's different than other times in life, like how specifically is it different? He says like the first one is this idea of identity exploration. I've kind of been hitting on this a little bit that, well, it's a time in your life where you're sort of trying to figure out who you are and how you fit in and and maybe even experimenting with different things like trying out going away to school or maybe like living with someone for the first time or maybe moving away for the first time. And there's this exploration aspect of it that's deeply related to things like identity and they're like especially around things like love and work. There's a certain, again, this is saying like what would you say is like some main ideas that characterize this, and another one would be this idea of instability that you might be moving around, you might be changing where you live, you might have like instability in relationships or work or school, even maybe like you're doing your undergrad and then you're going to go live somewhere else and work or do a master's or something. And it's like there's also this increased self-focus and this isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's not like saying people are selfish. It's saying that maybe you're at a time where you've moved out, you're kind of focused on your career development at this time. There's like that's okay. It's okay to be ambitious. It's okay to have goals, right? That's what you're supposed to be doing at your age. There's often this feeling of sort of being in between, right? Being in between, you're not that long ago a kid, and you don't feel like these old guys like me or like old people. You're like, yeah, it's like so. It's a fascinating time. In some ways, it's the best years, right? It's like in some ways, I'm jealous. I would like in some like 'cause I'm 42 now. To me, another one of those. Just got another one. I think I mentioned this on the last slide, but I keep getting these like pop-up windows saying that there's a fire drill at my work. Which what are they doing having a fire drill at 12:20 at night? Um, maybe it's actually an actual fire. And anyways, because it's like a work computer, uh, I get the pop-up. But yeah, and then anyways, I think I just have 5 left. That yeah, it's an age of possibility. There's so much ability to change direction. right? Whether it's like just think of yourselves. It's like you're going to class at Nipissing. Maybe you're single. Maybe all of a sudden you meet someone and fall in love. The Romeo and Juliet, whatever it's like, and then that butterfly affects your life in this direction, or maybe not. Maybe it's something more like related to work, or maybe you make a really good friend, and all of a sudden you get you two like roommate together, and then that's like a major life turn, and then maybe you get involved in like certain clubs or certain things that you wouldn't have otherwise. It's like all that's like that stuff happens more at that age than at say like my age is kind of my point. All right, time for me to get some sleep. I'm gonna have a class in the morning, and then early afternoon I'll finish up this recording and hopefully get it out to you tomorrow night. But yeah, thanks for listening to my rants. I'll catch you in the next slide.
Back, my friends, or this is just the next slide, I guess, or the next second if you're watching the video. Me and the class mascot, Scotty, are back on the attack. You can't really see him. It's kind of just a little bit out of the range of a computer turn. As we move through adulthood, one of the things that the chapter talks about is how there's these like markers of adulthood that are sort of, and a lot of you, I probably don't need to explain this to you because you probably feel pressure around some of this stuff in your own life. It's like, what are you going to do work-wise? What are you going to do bills-wise? What are you going to do in terms of just like where you're living, in terms of, are you going to date? Are you going to live with that person? Are you going to, stay with your parents? Are you going to live in a different town? All these like important decisions, right? That's one of the kind of markers of this emerging adulthood period. That seems to cut across cultures, and in some cultures, like I say, they're in developing countries, marriage is often statistically a more significant marker of adulthood. We could have interesting discussions around that, like what's the effect and what's maybe some of the reasoning behind that statement. Right, so if you look at all of that as a connected thing, it's like, well, what's the pressure? The pressure is to like sort of figure out who you are and start being that. And some of the kind of experimenting with what I want to do becomes like sort of less cute to everyone as you get later into your 20s and into your 30s. And it's like, okay, well, who are you? What are you doing? How are you going to like kind of, how's your plan going to play out? I like making this point, and you're all smart university students who've probably been exposed to ideas like this, but and I've said this in other maybe lectures, but I think thinking of developmental psychology and evolutionary psychology is basically the same thing, just with different scope of vision, right? That it's like when you're born, you live your life till you die, and throughout that time you develop. And if you put your life and then your kid's life and then their kid's life and then their kid's life, you'd see how over time there's this evolving aspect of that family tree line. And so it's like evolution's just a bigger time word, whereas like, or you could say it that evolution goes across generations, development is within a generation. Development is what we see, is why I have that in yellow. That if we say, okay, kids tend to start walking and talking roughly around 2, like a little bit before, a little bit after, whatever, but from a developmental psychology perspective, why are we saying that? Well, developmental psychology has this long, deep history in observational analysis, I'd say, observational record taking and analysis, like charting when kids do things through large scale experiments and watching lots of kids. Right, so it's like, well, how would you say that kids do this at a certain age? Well, you have to pay attention and you have to actually observe it and see like, okay, well, they start doing this at this age and that's sort of interesting, but what if like this kid does too, and then this kid does too, and then this kid's a little bit earlier, but this kid's a little bit later, but then this other kid's basically the same as the middle, and you start to see like the average is actually way closer than you would think. And so developmental psychology is looking at what we see when we observe people and behavior. And it's the what we're looking at. I'm going to say on the next slide that the why, like why is it 2 that kids start to do that? Why isn't it 7? Why isn't it 2 months? It's like, well, those, now you're asking questions that go deep into the evolutionary past. So evolutionary psychology and developmental psychology are sort of in the same area, in the same subdivision of biological psychology. Developmental psychology is a scientific approach which aims to explain how children and adults change over time. A significant portion of these theories are going to be focused on kids, right, as this is the period of the most change. And I've sort of said this randomly a few times, but it's like the 3 biggest developmental changes in life are what happens in the womb, the first 2 years, and then puberty. Okay, so if we look at developmental as the what, that's sort of my point here. The next idea is that the why would be evolution, right? So like, well, why do kids start doing this at this age, or why do some humans have red hair and blue eyes that seem to be recessive traits and mutations? You know, what's the evolutionary trace of that? Right? Why do we use language the way that we do? Why do we perceive things in certain ways? Why are we more sensitive? Like, for example, with perception, like why are we so sensitive to movement? Right? If I'm talking over here and something over there on my wall for some reason shook, like my eye would pull to it. Well, that was an important thing to keep our ancestors from getting killed from predators and stuff. There's functional reasons based on pressures related to natural selection, and natural selection meaning just like nature selects, that there's pressure on things where they are, right? That like based on the pressures our ancestors were under, we develop certain things, like our way of handling stress, like our way of using memory, like our way of using language. And that these are responses to our engagement in a complicated world, right? So like, where does it, so this is where it's gonna like, this is the where did it come from piece. So another, oh yeah, so I accidentally clicked once too much and now I'm recording in the next slide, but I think if I just go with it, it's okay. I don't want to redo that last slide. Okay, I think we're cool. So physical development in early adulthood. Yeah, it's not really a surprise. Most people are sort of their physical peak a little bit before the age of 30. And you see that in like athletes and stuff, right? Like that oftentimes peak performance is sort of like 19 to 26. You'd see that like whether you're looking at basketball or hockey or baseball, maybe be a tiny bit older. Soccer, like a lot of pro sports, like obviously people play earlier and later, but some of the best are going to be in that age range. It seems to be associated with kind of peak performance, and muscle tone and strength can start to show signs of decline around the age of 30. And some of it's even like the reason I have this picture of the eye, like even the lens of the eye can lose some of its elasticity, like some of its, you know what elasticity means? It's elasticness. It's like ability to adapt and be elastic, like less able to change shape and focus on near objects. So that can affect like nearsightedness. That hearing starts to decline, right? Which is like kind of the classic thing you see on every sitcom where like the old person's like, what? They can't hear? And it's like, well, that's actually is associated with aging, that there is like auditory decline. Fatty tissue increases. No one needs to talk about that. Yeah, it's just like And some of this is related to metabolism, and some of this is related to you just getting older. And as you get older, your body's changing, and it's changing. It takes more and more maintenance to sort of stay at the same level, is what I mean. It's always like such a. I struggle the most with these types of slides, to be honest. Um, yeah, like the risk of accidental or even like scenarios like suicide are two of the leading causes of death between 15 and 34, like that. It can be a time of incredible pressure, and I say there are like things like inactivity or diet or obesity or substance use and issues around reproductive health, healthcare access. Is a lot of these things we struggle with more at this time than at other times, and some of this is like stress and pressure and bills and breakups and bosses and the news. And it's like, so it's like they're saying that the rate of being overweight increases from 26% to 32% between first and fourth year students. It's like, okay, well, what's a major difference between first and fourth year students besides just age? And you could probably say stress level, right? It's like, how much does things like that play into it? And then how much is that kind of stuff then linked with all these other things like diabetes and cardiovascular issues and just general your body's this super complex system. And sometimes you think of mental health as being entirely cognitive. And a lot of your mental health lives in your behaviors. And in how you treat yourself. And it's not like I'm like perfect, and it's not like I'm in like I could do a lot more. It's like, but I think you act in a way, and the thing that's like impossible to explain is how you witness yourself acting. It's like everyone knows that. Obviously, when you're going through your day, you're seeing yourself, like you're having a first-person experience of your life. But people underestimate how much the fact that you're seeing yourself do whatever you're doing affects how you see yourself, affects how you value yourself, affects then how you behave. And it becomes this like, that's what's called the feedback loop, when it's like the way you do this affects how you do this, which affects how you do this, which affects originally the first thing. That's when a feedback loop. That's a weird way to end the slide, but. And I sometimes, again, I just already said this, and that I sometimes struggle with these kind of things where it's anything that's about, like, the next one slide's about STDs, and it's like this slide's about, like, drinking and stuff. It's like, it's hard not to, especially with the age difference, sound like I'm like old man mainland being like, don't drink. I'm obviously not that simple of a person, and you're not that simple of a person. It's. But let me be honest, it's like there's not many things that have taken out, especially more good men than alcohol. And if you think that was a sexist sounding statement, then maybe just, I need to send you a few more stats. It's like alcoholism is absolutely a bigger problem in males. Just like certain things like maybe anxiety disorders are a bigger issue with females. It's not that males aren't, you could even look at a lot of alcoholism as mistreated anxiety. And maybe the levels are actually closer than we would think. And maybe it's that there's a lot of complexity. And maybe our patterns can get out of control. And again, some of those patterns are self-talk. Some of those patterns are behavior. Some of those patterns are who we are around certain people. Some of those patterns are relationships. So I say, yeah, young men are more likely to take drugs. You know, and again, drugs, like, I was even saying to my students in Kitchener the other day, like, I think sometimes adults do a disservice to students being like, drugs are drugs or drugs or drugs. It's like, well, yeah, if you smoke a bit of weed, that's actually quite different than if you take crystal meth. And like, my city of Kitchener is getting destroyed by crystal meth at a certain level. And like, it's one of the major things you have to decide in your life is what is your relationship to things like substances, because they can get a grip on you. Again, I said, like, there's probably nothing that's taking out more good people. And again, at the other side, it's like, and I have drinks sometimes. It's like, it's not like I'm not trying to preach to you. I'm just saying, like, I don't know, I'm trying to just talk to you as real people. These are difficult things to try to talk about without being preachy or without just reading lines, right? Like, yeah, it peaks around 21 or 22, and probably some of that's because you're maybe away from home, around friends more. It's big time on the rise, especially with Canadian women. Right, and again, like 20 and 34, some behaviors at 24 are a little bit different at 34. Right, so that last point too, the brain undergoes drastic changes not yet completed by young adulthood, and this may lead to addiction faster because of the young brain has more susceptibility to alcohol-induced toxicity. It just gets there easier and faster, and so maybe that link can be hardwired earlier. Okay. Okay, so family structure, peer influence, this like emerging sexuality again. This is like, well, presenting on this topic as much, but it's maybe because I also know that I'm also like a male teacher teaching like almost a fully female class. I know there's a couple males in the class. And so I'm kind of aware of how, and I'm also older, and I really don't want to have like that preachy tone, but at the same time, I can't just dodge every difficult topic or else I'm not being a teacher, right? It's like I believe in what a teacher's supposed to do is like learn about topics and then try to think of ways to explain them. Basically, it's like early sexual activities and early sexual promiscuity seems to affect males and females different, and the research says it clearly, and it's awkward. It's like, well, for females, it's oftentimes a lot of early sexual activity is linked with internalized problems, whatever that means. And it's like, well, whereas it seems like better with guys, and it's like, it's interesting because my daughter's all into Taylor Swift now, and her song "If I Was a Man" or whatever sort of makes that exact point. It's like, which I bet you didn't think I was going to make a Taylor Swift reference in this video, but yeah, that it actually like affects the self-image and the societal reputation differently. And that, that's the other thing is that, again, talk about sounding like an old man. Like Brave New World, the book, is the ultimate lesson on like the dangers of over casualizing some of the most intimate things you do. It's just for most of your ancestors that stuff wasn't casual, and you're not necessarily evolved for it to be. And I'm not even saying like you can't date different people, but when I mean casual is more like acting like it doesn't matter, that it doesn't matter, that it doesn't affect your psychology, that it doesn't affect you. It highly affects you. It's weird talking about some of these things when there's no responses and stuff, because it would be interesting to hear what you think about it. But okay, next slide. Okay, I'm much more, and it's not. I see the value and the importance, and yeah, that. But now that we're back to Piaget, this is more my comfort zone. It's like Piaget thought that there was actually almost like another stage, right? That some people reach, and again, he didn't necessarily think everyone reaches this level, but a more adult level of post-formal thought where you're more reflective and you're more relativistic, and you can see that like some people might have a point and you still don't agree with them because things are situational and they're context specific, contextual thinking, and sometimes things are provisional. How you view provisional means that like, well, I might have saw this thing a certain way, but I already know this and this, and because I know this and this, I understand this differently. Then it's not a new piece of information, it's a piece of information that relates to things I already know. It's like this more nuanced, deeper understanding way of thinking about things, and you're realizing like how I say that recognizing emotional influences, that you realize that when you're upset, you're actually evaluating things differently than when you're not upset, and that you're actually learning how to take that into your in the moment process. And Piaget is saying this is like almost like a higher potential level, this post-formal thought. Right? That some theorize that many individuals, not all, consolidate formal operational thinking, which we kind of said is the last of Piaget's 4 stages in adolescence, and that the result is the emergence of this more sophisticated cognition in young adulthood, almost like another stage. So there's a couple more kind of somewhat random seeming topics that I want to touch on that just are also like relevant for this life stage. Like number one, some of the literature's not mistaken, but like kind of misleading on this, where we do see a declining creativity as people get older, but I put in brackets there, like creative at what? Like it depends. Like it's like, yeah, I'm 42 years old. I don't do a lot of, I was about to say I don't do a lot of coloring, but I actually probably color more now than at any time in my life, because I have actually when my 7-year-old was littler, younger, I did used to color with her all the time, but now I'm doing quite a bit of coloring. It's like, so I should maybe restart this slide because that was a bad example. But let's just say it's like maybe you don't color much, but maybe you're like listening to interesting out there kind of specific podcasts on different topics, and you're like reading books and you're watching interesting movies and you're having interesting conversations. It's like there's maybe less artistic, I don't even know, artistic's not even the right word, because like if you're enjoying and analyzing music and movies, that's all like in the realm of art. So again, it's like saying creativity goes down is probably true in like general, but people are still creative. It just tends to get more specific to what they're doing. It's like I might be decently creative at how I explain certain things or whatever. It's like my creativity is sort of limited to like my areas of more interest. So, and this is the idea, right? So that people that are higher in creativity often experience this state of flow. And like, cause that's, if I think of myself, like I'm not all that creative in a way. Like I'm not like writing songs, obviously. I'm not like, I don't know how to play instruments. I'm not gonna be like, if I didn't have a 2-year-old, I wouldn't be probably coloring or doing stuff like that. But then like, I like reading about outer space. I like thinking stuff that's like pretty creative. So so if you said I'm not at all creative, it's like, I don't know if that's true either, just because I don't draw much. So see what I mean? How it's like, it kind of depends. Like, what actually do you mean? Right? And the idea is that like some people are just more both interested and capable of kind of expanding into novelty more frequently, and that can be experienced with this like intense enjoyment, right? Like it's like, I find even with something like this where sometimes if feel like I'm saying something that's like decently matters, and I feel like it's easier to talk to your group now that I feel like I know your group pretty well, and so I feel like that I can basically think about the topic and try to explain it, and sometimes let ideas or whatever come out, and I don't know, is that creative, or is that just like, so this all comes down to, if you were actually going to measure it, you'd have to create some kind of psychometric and be specific. Okay, you're defining creativity as whatever the frequency of doing artistic work, blah blah blah. Maybe you have some kind of criteria that you're going to then measure and compare me to someone else, and you start to realize that actually like creativity is a fairly decently difficult to quantify variable. It combines nature's elements of both nature and nurture, and the conscious and the unconscious are equally essential, right? It's like just in the unconscious. And so like, to me, part of that is how sometimes you see me struggle when I'm presenting, when I'm like saying something, my conscious is like focused on what I'm saying. And then it happened to me the other time when I was talking about the media being aimed at like teenage girls, and it's like almost there's like a part of, I don't know if it'd be even right to say my unconscious, but like a part of my mind that's like almost yelling at me that I need to be more intense about how evil that is. And it's like, what is that? Like, I guess we could just label it an unconscious influence and just kind of bury it, but it's like, it almost demands itself into consciousness. It's like, and so because to be truly unconscious, I wouldn't even be able to label it like that. So maybe it's subconscious. And see how you get into these like deep waters, right? Maybe what I was just calling unconscious was really subconscious, and maybe the upsetness. Right? It's like human beings are complicated. It's like you're the most complicated thing in the universe, and that's why you're awesome. Okay, so let's just, I kind of forgot even that I had just this picture of like, because I was just randomly talking about coloring, and this picture of like coloring, I guess basically like a light bulb. It's like, well, what are some of the, you even see it as a thing now, like this idea of adult coloring books, and like, or even you like playing on your guitar for a bit, or going for a walk and having like an interesting random conversation with a stranger or with your friend, or like, watching a cool movie or a weird song or whatever. It's like, I don't know, I have noticed some of this stuff on this list, that when I've like actually sat down with Charlotte and spent like 20 minutes trying to color like a barn really nicely, or whatever the picture is, not worrying about whatever bills, stress, work, the just constant chatter. It's like, yeah, you can see how that like reduces stress and anxiety and increases your positive emotion, makes you feel less depressed, reduces like kind of negative emotion, helps your immune system, helps your self-esteem in general, makes you feel like you're, getting something accomplished, helps you be more concentrated, focused, happy. you could go as far as to say it's therapeutic, right? There's no surprise why things like art therapy are a thing. I think, if anything, those are untapped fields. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of things in that, but like, oh, there's so much more potential. And like, if I was a grad student these days, like one thing, and if anyone wants to steal this idea, it's like people should be running with the idea of using VR in senior homes and creating like Elvis nights. Steal that idea, create a VR Elvis night for senior homes, make $1 million and we can all retire. No, but I mean, I'm not even talking about it from a money generating perspective. It's like, what, and why'd I pick Elvis? It's like, okay, well, imagine if you could put a headset on somebody that's almost like even chair bound and have them have a virtual reality experience of being at a concert of someone they loved when they were younger, and then watch their mental health for the next week. And I think you'd have fascinating results. They've done those kind of studies on smaller levels of just having like 50s nights and stuff at senior centers and seeing that like people's depressive symptoms go down for weeks. Canada has a very aging population. If you have any interest at all at working therapeutically with older populations, I'm telling you right now, that's going to be an area where there's all kinds of work. So it's just something to keep in mind. Okay, just a couple more things. This is going to be a bit shorter presentation. I have some real whoppers coming up. I have some longer ones, but this one will probably slide in close to an hour. So earning a living, choosing an occupation, establishing your career, developing your career, these are all like important things for this idea of adulthood. And at a certain level, you could be like, okay, yeah, these are all like the details of life. But from the psychology perspective, we're like almost looking at it as this is more important than that, because this is also what gives you kind of a sense of purpose in who you are and aims you. It orients you, and orient means like, are you facing right or are you facing left? Which way are you oriented? It's like purpose. It says there, purpose is a missing ingredient in a lot of adolescent and emerging adults' experience, right? And especially like in this post-pandemic, like 2024 constant negative news world, where it's like understandable if people feel a bit of a lack of purpose and meaning and direction, but at the same time, it's probably the most single important thing for you to develop personally is a sense of what you're doing and what you're doing it for. And that, I was just talking to my students this morning about Viktor Frankl and the whole idea of logotherapy and the whole idea that like when you care about things, you act differently towards them. And when you think things have meaning, you act as if things have meaning. And when you think nothing matters, you act as if things matter, as if nothing matters. And that's different than when you act as if things do matter. And it sounds like a tongue twister, but it's actually like one of the most fundamental understandings of psychology is that there's this like butterfly effect out from how you perceive and value things, because it shapes how you then approach them, and it shapes how they then respond to you, and how you then interpret that interaction, and then how you then view yourself as a base in response to that, and then how you then move forward. So this is like this, I know I'm getting in the deep water, but this is again this like feedback idea. Right? That work can define people and can be key to their identity. And we're going to see this later in life, that like sometimes when you're your age or even my age, assuming that like you're, I don't know, whatever. I know all of you are different ages, but let's assume some of you are like your early 20s and I'm like my early 40s. It's like there's differences between those stages, but both of us are somewhat defined by like your role as a student or my role as a teacher. And what we'll talk about later in the course is like what are some of the psychological effects of when that goes away, like with retirement, and why is there this like connection between retirement and depression. Shouldn't retirement be entirely positive? And how, hobbies can be a huge buffer against depression. And we'll talk more about that. But it all kind of links to this way of how work affects identity and how we see ourselves. Now, I don't know if this is true. And okay, so a millennial, I forget, I should have looked this up before I just freestyle it in this slide. I think I'm still Generation X because I think millennials start in, so I was born in 81. I thought millennials started in 84, like my brother's age, but maybe I'm wrong. But I read something that said something like millennials on average in England now are missing a day, the equivalent of a day a week on mental health and stress related leaves. So the equivalent of 1 out of 5 working days. So that's not like people are taking a day off a week. It probably means that they're working like a couple months and then missing a couple weeks. So like just the math comes down to basically 1 out of 5. It's like when that's an average of a country, of a whole age range of people, right? It just kind of speaks this idea of how, and doesn't just speak to the difficulty of balancing work and life. It also speaks to just some of the butterfly effect, after effect of all these last few years. But it's like, and by butterfly effect, I mean the law of unintended consequences. You were meaning to do this and you did that, but you also did all these other things that weren't necessarily the intention, but were still very much the consequence. A lot of people today want more flexibility, and understandable, right? And most employers offer less for flexibility. Like from their perspective, they're paying you to be there. But nowadays workers want more flexibility, and I understand that too. It's like I value that big time myself. Unemployment can produce all kinds of stress, right? And even not even full unemployment. This like the dirty word nowadays is the gig economy, right? Like a gig, like a GIG, like used to hear that term related to like maybe musicians would have a gig on a Friday night at the store. It means like you don't work at that, or I said the store, I meant to say like the bar. So maybe there's some pub and there's a person that has a gig that he plays guitar there on Fridays, and that means that he gets paid to be there Fridays. But you sort of know that the word gig means like a sometimes job. Okay, well, what's a gig economy then? What's an economy where everyone just has a bunch of sometimes jobs? Yeah, and anyways, if you've never heard that term, you should Google what a gig economy is. And if you got what I just said, you kind of get the idea. And you can see the danger, right? It's like the idea of having, okay, how close to home should I go? Yeah, it's like having like a bunch of term to term people, right? It's like, what's that mean? It means like when it's not guaranteed, that's a gig. That's a gig. I'm not saying what I have with Nipsing's a gig, but it's more so a gig than Conestoga, right? Meaning like I could be replaced tomorrow. It's like there's no protection or anything, and that's just how it is, and that's fine. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that's very different than, say, like Conestoga, where I'm fully union protected. It's like a completely different situation. And that's a good slide to maybe end on. Okay, so quick review session, lightning round. Cue the music, Scotty. Cue the music, Scotty. All right, cat's still sleeping. He's slow on his DJ duties. And that was probably a failed joke, but maybe it made a couple of you smile. Emerging adulthood, this time of transition from adolescence to adulthood, characterized by, this experimentation and exploration of your world. The transition from high school to post-secondary can involve both positive and negative, this major change in life. And one of the major benchmarks we talked about for adulthood is this struggle to find purpose in sometimes a world that maybe doesn't seem super purposeful. How do you find meaning in meaning? What's the saying? Darn, I messed it up. What is the meaning of meaningful meaninglessness? It's like I don't agree with that, by the way, but that's a Kafka saying. That's just a guy's last name. Physical peak physical performance is often reached between 19 and 26. Towards the later part of adulthood, there's a detectable slowdown in physical performance, unfortunately. Health problems in emerging in young adulthood include everything from things like obesity to issues with substances, as we discussed. Patterns of sexual activity change during emerging adulthood. Yeah, I wonder why I have that as point number 7, because I feel like I didn't necessarily directly talk about, yeah, that even like who people find attractive. It's like that's actually a pretty difficult question. I don't necessarily mean orientation wise. I mean like even just like why you might find one person attractive and not another person is actually kind of complicated and has genetic, hormonal, cognitive, and environmental factors behind it. Again, I didn't go too deep into STIs, but you've definitely heard of that, right? Another risk factor associated with this time period more than others. Okay, last couple points. I'll have to redo this slide because I accidentally clicked once too many in it. There is no 22nd slide, so that messed up the 21st slide. Anyways, Piaget had the idea that there's the 4 stages, right? Like sensory motor, pre-operational, operational, post-operational, and then or pre-operational, operational, and then formal operational. And then there's this idea that there's actually like maybe even another stage called post-formal, right? Because the labeling's not that creative. It's just basically saying like what's post-formal. It just means like after it. That if there's the formal stage, that's the 4th stage. Maybe there's a 5th stage that's this post-formal stage that's more kind of classified or characterized by more like pragmatic thinking, or like you do things because it works and you don't do things because it doesn't work. And pragmatism is like the study of doing things because it makes sense to do them, being pragmatic. That as we get older, we get more kind of conservative in our thinking. And I don't mean that politically, I mean that like old fashioned. We get more set in our ways. And it seems like that's by design. It seems that like it makes sense that when we're younger to explore, and then as we kind of become who we are to solidify. I don't think that that's all a negative. I think that actually makes sense. All right, I hope you enjoyed this. I know I got into some weird places at a few places in this lecture, but again, I'm trying to be more than just like a bald-headed slide reader, right? I hope that I can have at least some kind of, I hope you can at least see him trying. All right, cheers and all the best. So this presentation will be the content for quiz 2. Cheers.